Hey there, I'm Josh, and welcome back to The Lord of the Rings Artifacts of Arda. In the last episode, I focused on the moment in the film in Bag End when Gandalf reveals the true nature and hidden secret of the One Ring to Frodo. Moving along in the film, Frodo is joined by his loyal companion Sam, and together they set out to leave the Shire after learning that the Nazgul, Ringwraiths, and servants of Sauron are on their way to reclaim the ring for their master. Along the way, Frodo and Sam run into Merry and Pippin, up to their normal shenanigans as usual. The four hobbits join together, and after narrowly escaping the clutches of the Nazgul, they make their way to the village of Bree and the Inn of the Prancing Pony. Now, I was considering doing the sign for the Prancing Pony, and I still might at some point. But more so, I'd like to focus on the more iconic props and weapons, and I'm kinda limited on which 12 items to make for each film. But who knows, maybe after this series ends, I'll revisit things in the appendices. Anyway, while attempting to meet Gandalf at the inn, the hobbits encounter a mysterious stranger, Strider, a ranger from the north. Frodo accidentally slips on the ring, which alerts the Nazgul to their whereabouts. With Strider's help, the hobbits manage to trick the Ringwraiths and give them the slip. Strider then leads the hobbits through the wilds on a journey to Rivendell. Along the way, they make camp at the abandoned watchtower of Weathertop. In a moment of poor judgment, 3 of the hobbits decide to cook up a little snack of tomatoes, sausages, and nice crispy bacon, unaware that their small campfire has basically become the beacon of Minas Tirith. The firelight immediately draws the Nazgul toward their prey, and Strider is nowhere to be found. The hobbits get in a defensive position atop the ancient tower. With the wraiths fast closing in, Frodo stumbles to the ground, and one of the wraiths draws a wicked-looking blade. In a panicked attempt to hide, Frodo slips on the ring once more, disappearing from the physical plane and arriving in the spiritual realm, where he sees the Nazgul in their true form. Twisted, demented former kings of men. The leader of the wraiths reaches out to grasp the ring, and Frodo recoils. The horrid wraith strikes forward and pierces Frodo's shoulder. With Frodo wounded and the hobbits surrounded, it seems as though hope is fleeting. When suddenly, with a cry of fury, Strider leaps into the fray. A torch in one hand and a sword in the other, he goes on the attack, wildly slashing and striking the wraiths like a man possessed. He drives the Nazgul away and comes to the aid of Frodo, when he notices the blade with which Frodo had been pierced. A Morgul blade. A cursed weapon which causes the victim to be poisoned and eventually become a wraith themselves. I know we've covered a lot of story between last episode and today, but this is a truly iconic moment, and it's one that I want to focus on as the inspiration for today's project. I'll be making the Morgul blade out of basswood once again, in a manner similar to what I did with Narsil. I've got a lot to do, so let's get to work. This knife will be made using the same stock that I used for Narsil. I first marked the board and then cut it down to the correct length. Then I ripped it down to get it a little bit more narrow. I marked a reference line along the center of the board and then took it to the router table to cut my blood grooves or fullers. I used the same bit here that I had previously used to cut the groove on Narsil. Next, after I lightly glued down the template, I cut away both the pommel and the crossguard to be used later. I marked some reference lines for the tang and then removed the grip template as well. Then, using the bandsaw, I cut it all out, being sure to stay just outside the lines to leave some extra material. Using the disc sander, I snuck up on those reference lines to get it to the correct shape. Still using the disc sander, I began to taper the sides to what I initially thought was the correct shape. I then switched to the orbital sander in an attempt to fine-tune the edges. That's when I realized that this blade wasn't looking the way I wanted it to, and instead looked like a big piece of crap. So I made the decision to start over. Rather than re-showing all those preceding steps, I just got the blade up to the same point and skipped the step of attempting to taper the sides using the disc sander, this time opting to use the orbital sander at a lower speed. This worked much better since I had increased control over the process. I went through a range of grits, ending on 320 to make it nice and smooth. Then I used a couple of chisels to taper the ends of the grooves. Once those were cut, I used some sandpaper to smooth everything out. Next, I used some ultrafine steel wool to rub the blade and make it super smooth. When done properly, I've found that the combination of both sanding and using steel wool leaves the basswood with an almost polished result, which makes it perfect for painting and in turn much easier to finish. Now that the blade was pretty much done, I moved on to the grip. I decided to change up my approach on making the grip as compared to how I did it with Narsil. This time using a solid block, which first I sliced a chunk off of. Then, on the thicker piece, I marked out some lines the same width as the tang on the blade. Then, using the table saw, I made a series of cuts, flipping the block around and adjusting the fence as I went, until I had all the material hogged out in the central notch. An alternative way to do this would be setting up a dado stack in the table saw to make a single pass for the cut, which I actually bought a dado stack recently, but the amount of time it would take to set it up for this one simple notch wouldn't be worth it. I glued those two pieces together and then moved on to the next step, the crossguard. I lightly glued the template onto the block and then made a crazy series of reference marks and lines. Once that was done, I took the block to the drill press and using a Forstner bit began to drill out the center for the blade to pass through. The Forstner bit, as always, worked really well for removing most of the material, but then I switched to a twist bit to hog out the rest of the material. This actually worked out really well, and I didn't even need to use a file or anything to clean it up. Next, I took the block to the bandsaw. You can see on the top that I drew out a shape for the crossguard. I didn't have any top-down reference photos to use, so I did the best I could. I cut off the 4 chunks and then glued them back into place so that I could cut across the face of the crossguard. This is the same method that I used to make Narsil, and it works really well. I should mention that this isn't something that I came up with on my own. I actually saw it before on Bobby Duke's channel on one of the crazy beautiful things that he always makes. I can't remember which one, it's been so many that I've watched. But credit where credit's due. You should go check that guy out. He's pretty awesome. I took the crossguard to the belt sander to refine the shape even further. Now that the glue is dried on the grip, I took it to the bandsaw and repeated the same process that I just did with the crossguard. And once again using the belt sander, I refined the shape of the grip. Next, it was time to make the pommel, which was by far the most difficult part of this entire project. I marked everything out on the block and then took it to the bandsaw as well. And guess what? I repeated that same process once again. I hate to fast forward the stuff too much, but I'm firmly in the lather, rinse, repeat part of this project, and you get the idea. And this is the piece that I was left with. I bet you can't guess which tool I'm going to use to refine the shape of this piece. Holy crap, you're just too smart for me. That's right, once again I'm using the belt sander. I suppose I could have used the wood lathe for this part, but if it ain't broke, then don't break it. Moving on, I used a little drum sander bit on my rotary carver to add a little collar to the pommel. Now this piece has a very strange shape. It almost looks like a tulip that's opening. So to accomplish that, I made a series of cuts using a bandsaw. Until the blade broke. So I switched to the scroll saw to finish it off. Once I got all the main cuts made, I took it to the drill press to hog out all the inner material. I also had to pick and pry and all kinds of nonsense, but I didn't film it because that was boring and annoying. Another thing I didn't film was the parts of me sanding the pommel and drilling a hole into it for a dowel rod to connect it to the grip. But that's not because that part was boring, it's because I'm stupid and I forgot. Next up, it was time to assemble everything. My original plan was to have the tang long enough to go all the way through the grip and stick into the pommel. However, that changed when I screwed up the first iteration of the blade, so the dowel rod works just fine. I gave the glue ample time to dry and then moved on to adding the clay. I first went along and filled in any gaps, holes, or seams, and then added a bit around the collar on the pommel. The next part wasn't recorded, but it wasn't my fault. It was actually due to a small error with the memory card, so I lost that little bit of footage. But basically I rolled out a lump of clay to make a sleeve to go around the grip. And as you can see, using my finger and some water, I'm making some ribs along the grip. I let the clay dry completely and then applied a coat of gray primer over the entire thing. Once that was dry, I used a utility knife to make some notches along the sides of the blade. Remember, this thing's supposed to look old and beat up and damaged. Next, using some hammered antique pewter spray paint, I applied multiple coats over the entire blade. Once that paint was dry, I brushed on some flat black Tester's model paint to the grip. After that was done, I moved on to my favorite part, weathering. I applied a liberal amount of shoe polish over all of the metal areas, wiping away a good bit of the excess, but I did this in multiple layers to add some depth. I also added a dusting of powdered graphite to key areas where soot and dirt would naturally accumulate. Once that was done, I used some silver rub and bump to add some extra depth and character to all the metallic parts. I did this very sparingly, focusing only on key areas to achieve the desired effect. Once I was satisfied with it, the Morgul blade was done. One of the nicer things about making this particular blade is that any extra blemishes or accidental mistakes actually add to the character. I'm really satisfied with how this project turned out. I think it's so cool how this blade looks like an ancient artifact of evil. In fact, while holding it, I find myself with the urge to get a ring wraith costume for this Halloween. Is that a bad thing? On second thought, maybe I should just put it up on a display on the wall. Regardless, I love how it looks, and I'm really happy with it. Well, this project was a lot of fun to work on, and I think the blade looks really cool. I love how ancient and beat up and just sinister it looks all together. Now, just like anything else, it's not an exact replica, but it's as close as I'm gonna get, and I'm pretty happy with it. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. That's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of The Lord of the Rings: Artifacts of Arda.